So, Michael, we'll just fill in a couple of seconds because usually when a Zoom webinar starts, there is people logging on frantically. So we'll give people a moment or two to join.
Excellent.
And we can just bask in the sunshine coming through your window over your shoulder.
It's slightly cloudy. We haven't got blue sky yet, but quite a relief. Last week was incredibly hot, so it's quite nice if you're working at home not to have it incredibly hot and looking beautiful outside when you're sitting looking at 3 computer screens for 10 hours or 12 hours per day.
Excellent. 3 computer screens. I struggle with 1.
Yeah, well, I don't want to say anything, Ken.
Yeah, I shouldn't give you openings like that because you may dive right in. So I think at this point the recording button will have been hit, and this Zoominar will be zooming out as it is over the digital airwaves and wires to particularly the staff of Haven Home Safe, various colleagues around Australia, and a few that we know that dial in internationally. So good morning to you, Michael, over there in Norwich.
Morning, Ken. Well, actually, I'm 20 miles outside Norwich, but you know.
I thought you would be in that idyllic countryside that is postcard picture of idyllic rural Great Britain and England in particular. So firstly, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm standing, or at least sitting, on the ground that is the traditional land of the Dja Dja Wurrung people, and I pay my respect to their elders, past, present, and certainly emerging. And we're fortunate in this community. We have a number of emerging leaders and elders as well. So that's a great thing for us. And for my staff who will be on different lands of different tribal groups, we also acknowledge that. And so welcome to, I don't know which number it is of these webinars that we've been doing as we now emerge into what is, I guess, a COVID normal world and all of the complexity involved with that. And as housing associations, we have very similar roles that we fulfill in all places all around the world. And this gives us an opportunity to talk amongst our peers and colleagues to see who's doing what. And as we like to here at Haven Home Safe, to approach this with an R&D lens. Now, R&D, of course, for most people means research and development. For us, it means rip off and duplicate. But anyway, I'd like to introduce you to my very great friend and colleague, Michael Newey, who I'll throw to in just a moment. But I'd like to formally, I guess, introduce to you Michael, who is one of the leading lights in the British and the United Kingdom Housing Association world, but not only that, but also in the Institute of Chartered Surveyors world. So Michael is firstly has an honorary doctorate, which I'll come to in a moment, and he has almost an alphabet of letters after his name, most of which start with F, which stands for fellow, usually the highest accolade of whatever professional body that is. Michael is the CEO of one of our favourite English housing associations, based in Norwich, which is a beautiful city built around an amazing castle that has had inhabitants since the Vikings and before. Broadland has over 5,500 or 5,100 homes, but Michael not only is the CEO of Broadland, but he was in 2013 and 2014 the global president of the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors, what we often refer to in Australia, erroneously I'm sure, as valuers. The Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors is the largest professional body in the world, I understand, with over 110,000 members around the world. Michael chairs surveying advisory boards at Portsmouth and Royal Agricultural University, so not one but 2, and Portsmouth University awarded him an honorary doctorate for his services to housing and surveying education. Michael, particularly for the people at Haven Home Safe, Michael is also a founding director of Homes for Kathy. And for those of us who are old enough to remember the pivotal and the seminal television series called Kathy Come Home, which really awoke a generation to the horrors of homelessness, the Homes for Kathy was established in 2016 to mark the 50th anniversary of the showing of that as I say, that seminal show. And Homes for Kathy, I'll ask Michael to speak about that a little bit later as we go along. But obviously, it's a lot about reminding people that housing associations as social landlords have a role to play in homelessness, of course. Michael also spent 3 months in 2008 where I first met him on secondment to the Victorian government and as an advisor to the then minister, who was, I think, Richard Wynne, who is now currently Minister for Housing again. And he was also an advisor to the Director of Housing as the Housing Association program began to have some life breathed into it. Prior to joining Broadland, Michael was a director of Anglia Housing, which is now part of Clarion, which is a very, very large group, and development director of Flagship Housing, and has also worked for CBRE, which in those days I think was Savills. I might also add that Michael is the chair of the Norwich Theatre, which comprises 3 venues in the city. Norwich is a remarkably cultural place, I'd have to say. And the most important thing, of course, which I'm sure that Michael would put in prominence on his biography, was that he was in fact the first thinker in residence at Haven Home Safe during his sojourn in Victoria. Although we didn't call it Haven Home Safe then, I think we called it something along the lines of this terribly polished young Englishman whose ideas we can pinch about housing associations. Michael, good morning to you.
Morning, Ken. Good to see you.
See you too. I should add that a number of my staff have had short stints and visits at Broadlands over the years and then come back enthused with the possibilities and all many new ideas of how we might approach things. But Michael, can you tell us a little bit about some of the recent achievements at Broadland before we dive into what's been happening around the world for all of us recently?
Well, perhaps I'll go back a little bit further and just give a tiny history of Broadland. Please. So you mentioned Kathy Come Home in 1966. Actually, Broadland was formed a few years earlier than that, 1963. An excellent year as far as I'm concerned. Other things happened in 1963. And it was very much like the Kathy Come Home era. It was people waking up as part of the community to the homelessness problem, the housing stress that people were experiencing, recognizing that the open market wasn't going to actually provide enough homes for those people that needed it, but neither was there sufficient council housing. So there were a load of people that were stuck in the middle with no ideal, no decent home to go to. So Broadland came out of the business community, funnily enough, in 1963, and started from one property, which it built in North Norwich, right the way through to where I joined it in 2003, when we had about 3,500 properties, 3,600. I actually joined at a period of crisis. The organisation had been going almost 40 years, almost exactly 40 years, and actually it got to the point where it wasn't quite sure what it was there for anymore. It hadn't modernised any of its business practices since the mid-1980s. So it was way out of date in so many different things, and technology particularly. But I think that what we needed to unpick was what was the enduring purpose of Broadland. I believe very strongly that organisations have an enduring purpose. However you change the name over the years, actually Broadland hasn't changed the name. I think you were Loddon Malley when I was out in 2008-9. You need to know what you're there for, and what is it that if the founders of the organisation walked into your office today, would they recognise the organisation as being the one that they envisaged, they had the vision for when they're starting up? Now, we decided that we had, if you like, a double vision. The first one was, and actually fundamentally important, look after the properties we own well, because actually those are places that people make their homes. A home is the foundation for everything else in life. So you always have to start, we felt very strongly, you had to start from a position, are you looking after what you've already got? And then are you stretching yourself sufficiently in order to meet more housing need? And so we decided those were the 2 key parameters, and at the same time recognizing where we should be and where we needn't be. So in fact, in 2004, we drew a boundary around ourselves and said we will not operate outside Norfolk and a little bit of Suffolk, which is the county directly below Norfolk, if you know the map of the UK. We wanted to be part of the neighbourhoods, we wanted to be part of the communities, we wanted to be joined up with our tenants, knowing where we own stuff, knowing who lived in the properties, knowing the local authority politics, etc., etc. So we felt quite clear that we weren't going to fall into the trap, which I have seen some housing associations over here falling into, of thinking we needed to be everywhere, but actually not being a master of all trades, but not, what's the phrase? Jack of all trades, but master of none. There's a risk sometimes. I remember in a previous employment at Anglia Group that we wanted to have housing stock in 56 local authorities. I couldn't know the politics of 56 local authorities. I couldn't know the street scene. I couldn't know what the issues were in particular communities. So that's the context. Fast forward to where we are today. Ignore COVID for a moment, because I'm sure we'll get onto that later in the chat. We're continuing to focus on those things, looking after the properties, supporting our tenants, and that's become really important. Tenancy support, tenancy engagement, recognizing that tenants have to be at the top table, but also wherever you happen to live, you have a voice, you are listened to by the organization, and that we can adapt our services accordingly. And then continuing to stretch ourselves for development, but also focusing on homelessness. On the development side, we had to reinvent ourselves. We were talking before we came on the proper Zoom webinar about the global financial crisis of 2008, 2009, where so many things were changed here in the UK. And one of them was the amount of funding available for new housing from the government. And for a number of years, we went fallow because we couldn't work out a business model that made new development work. To give you an example in figures, in 2007, 2008, we were getting an average grant rate of about £46,000 per property, per home. In 2011, we were offered £16,000 per property, per home, and we couldn't make the figures work. So over the last 5 years, 6 years, we've reinvented ourselves. We now have a market subsidiary called Broadland St Benedict's, which I chair, which is a market developer, and we match up open market sales with affordable provision. So, and we do the open market sales on the same site as the affordable provision. We're making it very clear to purchasers that they are supporting their wider community. And as a result, this last 12 months, ending at the end of March, we built 298 homes, of which about 75 are open market and support the rest. And within the rest, we have, I can't give you the numbers off the top of my head, but probably 2/3 is rented and 1/3 is shared ownership, providing people a way into the housing ladder when they can't actually have any idea about how they're going to get there.
It's a fabulous model. We've done in a microcosm one development where we've retailed into the marketplace about 170 odd lots and kept a smaller number, and essentially the sale of the lots that we put into the marketplace allowed us to then build what is 100 affordable homes for people in a particular suburb in Melbourne. And so that mixed use development really does give you not only the opportunity to take the profit out in the form of social housing, if you like, but also gives you the opportunity to master plan little estates, which is a fabulous opportunity.
It's about building communities, and very rarely, I live in a village in the middle of Norfolk, and my village at North Elmham is a strong community, but it's a mixed income community. It's mixed age community. You know, you've got people in the, actually, how do you say it? I can't say it. 100 people who are 100 years old and above, right that way down to babies. You've got people in work earning a lot of money. You've got people in work earning very little. You've got people living in benefits. And what you don't want to do is, even without the gate, create gated communities. Either gated communities of people who are very wealthy, or gated communities of people who are actually relatively poor, living on benefits, etc., etc. So I actually think the idea of a mixed community and facilitating that sort of idea of people being mixed in with people that aren't the same as themselves is really healthy.
Yeah, look, I obviously agree entirely, and I think all of the evidence points to that. You know, the broad acre public housing estates that were built ideally for, you know, for workers and the working poor, which have progressively around the Western world become the repository for benefit recipients and people with enormous vulnerabilities and complex problems. We all know, you know, what that does intergenerationally, not just to the people who live there. So the more that we can avoid those concentrations of disadvantage, the better. Michael, in terms of the role for Broadland, I mean, you're a bit of a poster boy for a whole bunch of housing association people with the work that you've done there at Broadland, and particularly in turning it around and refocusing it. I might come back if we have time to talk about that enduring purpose, because I agree entirely with you. We've certainly changed our name as our organisation has broadened our geographic scope, but our core purpose has remained, even though it's expressed differently, it's still about getting homeless people and people in housing crisis housed. And that is core to who we are and what we do. But in terms of your role and the dimensions of the CEO role, how much has that changed from, say, 2003 to now, 17 years? I mean, imagine the first couple of years would have been a bit of head scratching.
The first couple of years were, I think, only in hindsight exciting. At the time, I really wouldn't. I was going to say I wouldn't recommend taking over an organisation that's in an organisational and a governance crisis. Actually, in hindsight, it was probably really good. But at the time, it was pretty harrowing. I think I lost 2 stone in weight in 2004 and hardly had a day off, including weekends. So back in 2004, for a period, it was myself and the finance director who were in effect running the organisation. Very dysfunctional board. The board that appointed me, it was a board of 15 that appointed me. And when the regulator stepped in the end, 11 of those board members were removed. So in effect, I went down to a board of 4 for a short period, plus the Housing Corporation appointees. And I had an exec team of 2 of us. And the other one only wanted to do finance, really. So I was not only the chief exec, I was the housing director, the development director, the property director, the sweeping up the rubbish outside director, etc., etc. So very hands-on at the beginning. What the biggest responsibility I always think of anybody in management is to grow those people that they manage. And I think I've been really fortunate to have grown a really strong director team and senior management team. We've got a few anchor points. In the recent years, we've recruited a new housing director and a new finance director. And what you mustn't do as a chief exec is try to do their job for them. There's nothing more disempowering than having somebody saying, "Oh, that looks really exciting. I think I'll take that, and you can get on with the boring stuff." Or, "I'm sure you've got a crisis here. I'm here to fix it." So actually, you evolve into a bit of a mentor, but much more a coach of the people that you're working with. But at the same time, we've built great capacity in the board. I have to say, I think I've probably got one of the best boards I've worked with currently. And it's about, and I'm also a board member, which is I have been actually from day one, which was unusual back in 2003. Increasingly, chief execs are. And so it's also working really closely with the board. It's horizon scanning now. It's working, what are the strategic options? How do we deliver those options within the context of what's going on? As you might imagine, last year, back in June 2019, we adopted a new 4-year vision, a new 4-year corporate strategy. Funnily enough, COVID-19 wasn't within, if you did a word search on the document, you wouldn't have found it. And so very quickly, when March happened with the lockdown, we actually produced an interim corporate strategy within 3 weeks, adopted by the board, to say, right, this is what we're focusing on for the time being, and these are the things we're putting on hold. So it's being reactive as well as proactive. It's horizon scanning as well as looking at your colleagues and making sure that they're supported adequately in your role as a coach and mentor.
There's an enormous amount of similarities, I think, between our exposure as, well, in my case, executive officer, that eventually morphed into chief executive officer. The only difference was my dysfunctional organisation that was also effectively bankrupt only had, when I walked in after the first day, 1 staff member, which was me. And so, yeah, those first few years, Michael, I think we've talked about this in the past, it is 24/7. Every day, you eat it, you sleep it, you breathe it, and then you go to work. And these are tough times. The regulator who came to your rescue, that wouldn't have been our dear late friend by any chance, would it?
No, actually, Anthony sadly had decided that he was much more interested in going and living in Australia than being my regulator back here.
So we pinched him. Excellent.
And Anthony had been my regulator when I was at Anglia Housing Group.
Yeah.
Actually, he was at the corporation. I think he came over to Australia in about 2005-06. No, he was someone I could telephone for a conversation. We did actually consider for a short period whether I could appoint him as my coach, but his bosses suggested that actually being the coach to a chief exec of a housing association that was an intervention status from a supervision basis wasn't such a good idea. But I think it just demonstrates, I mean, thinking back to 2003-4, and obviously, you know, the way regulation happens here in the UK has changed quite considerably. We're on our third regulator since then, in that we had the Tenant Services Authority, and now then we had the Homes and Communities Agency, and now we've got the regulator of social housing. But I think what I learned so strongly in 2003-4 was working hand in hand with the regulator. You know, ultimately they're on your side, and ultimately they're there for the good of your tenants, as well as making sure that they're protecting the public dollar in effect. And so building that relationship was so valuable. And I think all of us in the UK were very frustrated when Anthony decided to go and live in Australia and regulate. I mean, I felt sorry for him because he was going to be regulating people like you, Ken. But you know, at the same time, you had a great person to really establish the regulation side in Victoria.
Yeah, that's very true, and he is sadly missed, unfortunately. But yeah, and but his stamp remains, I think. And you're absolutely right. I mean, you referenced the importance of working sort of hand in glove with boards, which is a critical component to getting anywhere, I think. And I guess one of the challenges for Australian boards is the Australian corporate environment, which is tyrannical. Is entirely different from the British model. And of course, the other thing is that housing associations or even homelessness services in regional centres, you know, we don't have the footprint of people who have grown up, if you like, with these things being part of the social fabric. And so there is a bit of onboarding for new directors, I think, generally across Australia. And it's still very much an infant but growing sector, but we are fortunate that we have had a great many, if I call them economic refugees from the UK, who've made their way over here, who run quite a number of our housing associations, and I'm sure you would know some of them. Michael, Homes for Kathy. You know, I mentioned that I think it was a black and white television show, as I recollect, and I remember being glued to the ABC as a young boy while our family watched it in horror, living, you know, in a sort of semi-idyllic regional lifestyle in Australia with the black and white telly in the corner of the lounge room, trying to comprehend how such things could happen in a modern society. But here we are 50 years later, and, you know, the last time I was in the UK, to be fair, the number of rough sleepers was not as pronounced as it is in, say, parts of America, or sadly in Melbourne and Sydney in Australia now. But it was entirely visible, and that was a big change from the first time I'd been in the UK a decade or so earlier. So tell me about Homes for Kathy and what that's about.
So when Homes for Kathy came about, which was early 2016, David Bogle, who's chief exec of Hightown Housing down near St Albans, north of London, wrote to a number of us who were chief execs of housing associations established in the 1960s and very early 1970s, and said, you know, we're coming up November, I think it's November the 16th, 1966, something like that. Kathy Come Home was broadcast on the BBC for the first time. And he said, we're coming up to the anniversary of that. Do you think we should be marking it? So in 2016, we were all focused on the idea, and we were quite snooty, really. We only allowed housing associations to join at that point that were formed in the Kathy era between the 60s and the early 70s. And it was all about, let's mark this anniversary, but let's mark it not from a point of celebration, but mark it from a point of sadness. You know, both Crisis and Shelter, the two big homelessness charities here in the UK, came into existence in 1966. Neither of them envisaged that they would have to still be here in 2016, let alone 2020. So let's mark it with sadness, and let's get it in front of our local politicians and our national politicians that actually you've been failing us. You know, the fact we've still got rough sleepers, the fact we've got lots of hidden homeless, the fact we've got overcrowding, we've got people who are experiencing domestic violence who can't escape because they've got nowhere to go safely. So that was what it was all about, and it culminated in an event at the House of Lords, where we got a load of MPs and a load of peers together in one room in the House of Lords, where we actually had Cardboard Citizens, the homeless drama company, where at least half their cast members have experience of homelessness, to perform parts of a play that was based on Kathy Come Home, but set in 2016. And then we had the meeting, funnily enough, the same day across the road at the RICS, where I got a meeting room. And we said, so is that it? Do we now stop? And we all said, hold on a moment, homelessness is still here. Shouldn't we actually now be continuing and carrying on the work and focusing on what the solutions are and actually trying to get the sector behind us? So we dropped our snootiness at that point. We said anybody could be a member of Homes for Cathy as long as they were committed to helping end homelessness. And we worked with Crisis specifically. They published in 2018 their plan to end homelessness. And you'll find, if you pick up a copy of that work, an appendix written by us inviting housing associations to sign up to 9 commitments that we thought would make a big difference. And we've grown now, we've got about 110 members, including some very large housing associations and some very small ones as well. The commitments were extremely challenging. So for example, the commitment not to evict somebody into homelessness. When I first announced to my staff team that that was going to be our new approach, having got board support for it, the income collection team looked with horror at the idea that we were taking away this tool of potential eviction to get people to deal with their arrears. Actually, what we said was we will not evict anybody willing and actively engaging with us into homelessness. And we've got authority from the board to freeze arrears, for example. So we can freeze arrears for up to 12 months initially, and then review it on a quarterly basis after that. And we will only ask the tenant to start paying back some of their arrears when they can actually afford it. But at the same time, we're asking them to pay their rent for that period. Now, actually, there's a great financial saving for us. We normally evicted somebody for arrears when their arrears were at about £3,500. You add on court costs, you add on the works that we do in avoid property, especially actually if someone's been evicted, they don't normally love the property at the point they leave. And you add on all the costs, and it costs us about £8,500 to evict somebody. By freezing their arrears and getting the cash flow going, we're not writing off that arrears. It doesn't hit the balance sheet as a write-off. So actually we're keeping somebody in their home at the same time as we're actually getting some income back from them. Another one, which was a bit more challenging, was about helping people who have no recourse to public funds who find themselves homeless. And we've worked closely with the imaginatively named team at Norfolk County Council called the People from Abroad team.
Hey, who do they deal with?
And it deals with people who actually, for whatever reason, have become homeless, lost their job or whatever, and either need to sort of re-establish themselves or work out how they might be going home. So actually we now rented for just a peppercorn a number of properties to Norfolk County Council so they can put people into homes and give them that 6-month, 7-month period to re-establish what's going on in their lives without actually just running up more and more debt. So the 9 commitments are really challenging, but actually from my view, they're completely aligned with the enduring purpose of Broadland. We are here to be a solution to homelessness. You can't, I was really disappointed when I went to the 50th birthday conference of Crisis. You had all these homelessness organizations in the room and 2 housing associations. When you go to a housing conference, you've got all these housing associations in the room and very few homeless organizations. And actually housing associations are the solution to homelessness. So we are homelessness organizations ourselves. And I think over the years, with the pressures that we've been put under by politicians, some of us may well have lost our way a bit on that one.
Michael, you are singing to preaching to the converted. You're singing to the choir, can I say? Because as you would know, we're a homelessness organisation that became a housing association, but our core is still as a homelessness organisation. But at the risk of stating the abundantly obvious, and I think this was a background on my Facebook profile for a while, there is only one known cure for homelessness, and it's called housing. I'm really taken with the 9 core principles that Homes for Cathy has adopted, and I will track down that crisis report on their plan to end homelessness. That sounds really interesting. And it's
I would look for the executive summary, Ken, because the full document's about 350, 400 pages long, but they produce some more succinct versions as well. read the succinct versions first and then move on into the great tones.
Well, you know, Michael, is if it's got more than 5 or 6 letters, I'll get lost in the word, you know. So
no pictures to colour in either. Yeah.
What? No pictures in the? What sort of book is that? Are there numbers to join? No, thank you for that. That sounds really interesting. So just to I guess the you know, really the topic du jour, which we've managed to completely avoid, COVID-19. You know, I think everybody's now understanding that whilst here in Australia we were talking about, you know, the first wave, and oh, are we in a second wave? Around the world, this is the first wave is hitting now. It's hitting hard. It's hit the UK spectacularly hard, and what it's doing in the United States, not to mention the developing world, is just is a horror story. But Michael, in the ideal surrounds of Norfolk and Norwich in particular, what's it meant for Broadland and the way you operate, and how, you know, how has it affected a day in the life of Broadland and the Broadland CEO, I guess?
Really good question. I mean, March was an interesting month. It's interesting. I was looking back. I was writing a presentation yesterday, and I found a presentation that I wrote on the 13th of March, envisaging that I would be delivering that presentation in April, not realizing that less than a week later, we would have closed all our offices and moved everyone to working from home. We actually closed our offices 4 or 5 days before the Prime Minister announced his lockdown for the country. I think what was really interesting there, 2 years prior, we had moved to agile working. So we had already equipped all our office-based staff with the right equipment to be able to work from home. We already were working in hosted environment. We already had the right software. But we closed an office on the Thursday evening, Friday morning. On the Monday, we were fully operational in 130 people's homes. And it was quite, you know, if you had told me in February that, for example, our customer services team or our finance team could all go and work from home and not need to be sitting around with each other to do their jobs, that's a really big stretch. And the reality was that our staff team were absolutely fantastic. Because we had had a digital by default commitment for about 3 or 4 years, we already had the infrastructure. So from an office worker's point of view, apart from the fact you were moving home and suddenly you had your children with you or your pets with you or other dependents distracting you, it worked really smoothly. From the repair side, because we do our own repairs, we got our own workforce of about 77 operatives on the repair side. It was making the painful decision that we were only going to do emergency and urgent repairs. We do about 17,000 repairs a year for our tenants. And overnight, we in effect pulled the rug. There were 1,000 jobs in progress that we pulled and said, sorry, we're freezing those, and we won't be doing them whilst we're in this crisis. It was interesting. We've only furloughed a small number of staff, but even then we decided not to claim the subsidy from the government. We're quite uncomfortable, you know, wearing my other hat as the chair of a theatre trust. I know what it feels like when your income's turned off. You know, with 225 staff at the theatre, we've got 188 on the furlough scheme, and we're claiming the government's money. Thank you very much indeed, because we've got no income. Actually, we've still got income coming in. We've still got our rents coming in. Okay, arrears have gone up a little bit, but it's not as if someone's turned off the valve. And we're quite concerned. We were quite concerned, and we had big debate about it with myself and some other chief execs in a group called Independent East, which we might talk about a bit later. Where we said, you know, it feels quite uncomfortable, because if actually we get to the end of the year having claimed all this money from the government and then we show in our accounts a big surplus as a result, that could really backfire politically for us. So we didn't. We furloughed, but we're paying for the furlough for people who were shielding, and a couple of our apprentices where they couldn't carry on their apprenticeships during that period. But broadly speaking, you know, apart from doing fewer repairs, we were still cutting grass, we were still doing flower beds, we were still doing all the work that you would normally do. It just happened that we weren't sitting in an office. And what's really interesting, we worked out that in the first, I think it was the first 6 weeks, the combined saving in mileage of our staff commuting to work was 65,000 miles.
Wow.
And you suddenly realize everyone's gaining an hour, 2 hours in the day when they would have spent it commuting. everyone's saving their money on their petrol and diesel, etc. You know, actually you start thinking that's quite a learning for us. That's something we're going to have to think about in the longer term.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, I think for us, we are not as progressed on the digital by default as we would perhaps have hoped. But having said that, we are, I suspect, and advise, miles ahead of many others. Excuse me. So, you know, I guess since about 2016, we've been trying to build digital capability so that we have a spine and a backbone, a platform to move to digital by default. And I guess, like you guys, we had, I think, when the lever was pulled and people had to work from home, and we literally had a few days to pull that together. We had about 50% of our staff who were on work-provided mobile laptops in any event. So we had a core group who could just immediately, essentially, work from home. And we had, like you, seen this coming, and we had a huge amount of laptops and various other electronic equipment on order. And fortunately, most of it arrived before the whole world ran out of equipment. And I think, you know, on the 3rd of February, as when my exec team started trying to ascertain the amount of PPE that we might ordinarily use and start to ramp some of that stuff up. Now, we obviously didn't get everything we needed, but we certainly had enough to get through. So very similar, I think. And in terms of the digital capability that we've been building, I think we have rapidly gone to digital almost entirely digital by default, if you like. So, and like you, urgent and essential maintenance works. And the interesting thing is, in talking to my asset and maintenance manager, no complaints, you know, or very few complaints. Most people have just gone, oh yeah, I understand that you can't have people come and visit me for a minor thing. And so our tenants, I think, have been remarkably generous, given the circumstances for us. So, Michael, what would you do differently, if anything? What's worked particularly well, and are you prepared to fess up? Was there anything that didn't go as well?
Actually, it's a really interesting one. What decisions did we get wrong? Not many. And actually, with the benefit of hindsight, I'd probably still do the same as we did. I think if there was anything, it was we probably took a moment or two too long thinking about what the impact on people's mental health well-being was of suddenly feeling isolated, or if you were still an operative and you were being asked to go into someone's home. And in that first month, it was quite interesting. In that first month after lockdown, we saw quite a high incidence of sick leave. But interestingly, we haven't had any member of staff diagnosed with COVID-19. Actually, touch wood, cross my fingers, etc. We haven't had any of our tenants die of COVID-19, which is actually quite unusual around here. And my colleagues in other housing associations are reporting different things. So I think if I'd had longer to think about it at that point, I would have thought about identifying people's home circumstances better. You know, it may not be the member of staff that's shielding, but they may be living with someone who's shielding, or they may have a dependent child with some form of long-term health condition. We were pretty good at redeploying staff. You know, we suddenly had a load of our repair guys who weren't going to do repairs because actually we're only now dealing with emergency and urgent. And it probably, we did get to the point where we redeployed them into befriending calls. So for example, we made contact with every tenant who was over the age of 70 to find out what their circumstances were. Did they have support? And for many of those, we then agreed that we would call them once or twice a week or a fortnight, whatever they wanted. And what's interesting is seeing some of the friendships that have developed as a result of people calling regularly every week to somebody who's in their 80s, and they built up a relationship. We took a day or two too long to think about how we put the infrastructure in to support tenants who needed help with prescriptions and grocery deliveries and things like that, who were shielding. I think the other thing the only thing I would change is having perhaps a clearer sense of what the implications are. You know, you and I have spent the last 3 months looking at a computer screen and lots of people's backgrounds. You know, I count the number of books behind you or whatever it is. And there's some days when you've gone back to back to back, which you would never do if you were in the office. You know, if you had a 9 o'clock meeting, it's going to last an hour, you wouldn't schedule the next meeting to begin at 10 o'clock. And some days, some of us have spent 8, 9, or even 10 hours constantly in video calls. And I think probably if we had realized that this is a really long process for us, we won't be back in our offices this year, this calendar year. There's only so much that people can keep going with that sort of pressure. And it's giving people permission for the valves, it's giving permission for the breaks. It's saying, now, is that meeting really critical? But actually, no, I can't think of many things that we got wrong. I have to say, I mentioned Independent East earlier, and I would just mention that again. Independent East is a group of 5 housing associations that have come together just to support each other. We actually agreed to do it last summer, and we were probably just getting there to what we might be doing. And actually, since lockdown, we've been having weekly calls, which has worked really effectively. The idea of having a very safe environment with 4 other chief executives to natter about what's going on, what problems have you got in your own organization, how are you feeling, that sort of thing has been extremely valuable. So yeah, I'm not sure that we've done anything that I would regret. I think what's going to be really slow is getting back into our offices, and that's our challenge now.
Yeah, and I think you know, Victoria and Australia has fared remarkably well with COVID-19, but we're now starting to see what we probably always expected, which is localized outbreaks. And we've certainly got that happening in Victoria right at the moment. So certain postcodes are going back into lockdown, if you like. Our lockdowns were not as extreme as in some other countries. But also, I guess what that's meant is, as people have come out of what we laughingly refer to as lockdown, people have just sort of gone, oh, okay, this is beaten, it's over, we can assemble into groups of thousands, you know, which of course has had all of the outcome you would expect as a result. You know, I think that there's so many things in speaking to colleagues from from Canada, from the US, the UK, and yourself, where we've really all done very similar things. You know, we're touching base with our staff, we're touching base with our clients, we're identifying those people at most risk and seeing what we can do to mitigate that for them where we can. And we're all doing back-to-back video conferences all day long, which frankly, I agree entirely with you. And I'm going to start scheduling no Zoom time fairly soon, I think. So one of the things, Michael, that I've always been remarkably, and you've no idea how it pains me to say this, but remarkably impressed by you with, is your ability to juggle so many big roles. And juggling the role as president of RICS was, I mean, I just followed your Facebook travels and I was exhausted just looking at them. God knows the work that would be done. I also know that you, whenever you would fly, spent most of your time literally writing presentations that you'd be delivering. And so your propensity for work is truly staggering. This is not a habit of yours I intend to follow, I might add. But the great work you did as president of RICS, you got together with our collective good friend Paul Tennant, who was president of the Chartered Institute of Housing at the time, and you did some work. Could you kind of give us a bit of a sense of what that was, where it ended, and what came out of that?
Yeah, I mean, it was interesting. It was an interesting couple of years, and you're right. Your time on aeroplanes was spent either sleeping or working. It was never watching a movie. It was quite interesting. I was very fortunate, you know, the first RICS president to come from the charity sector, first RICS president to come from a housing association, the sort of recognition that actually housing associations are not for profit property companies, and actually being able to talk through that message globally. I think I visited every continent apart from Africa, where my president-elect focused, and Antarctica, which funnily enough wasn't in our membership plans. Paul and I get on really well. We'd worked together in the past when Orbit, where he had been chief exec, and Broadland had worked together in the noughties on developments together. And he was a member of, we had an RICS Housing Commission in 2013. And Paul was a very active member of that and a huge support. We published a report in June 2013 with lots of very worthy recommendations, the majority of which have probably been ignored by governments and policymakers, but that's the trouble. But one of the things that actually did come out of it was we made a really strong case that we needed a UK housing observatory, some form of evidence centre. I've been really impressed by Huri in Australia, and the idea that there was this sort of impartial group of high quality academic researchers who could look at policy initiatives together and say, A, is that a good idea? And what are the unforeseen consequences, and will it actually work? But also, what other areas do we need research on? And following my presidency, I was really pleased that we managed to, cut a long story short, establish the UK Collaborative Centre for Housing Evidence up in Glasgow and Sheffield, led by our mutual friend Ken Gibb, which with funding, we got enough funding to get it going for the first 5 years from various research councils and the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. So there was one thing I would say that I was particularly delighted with, was the fact that that evidence centre now exists. I think, if I'm honest, I think Paul and I, we weren't failures, but we failed to build the bridges between the Chartered Institute of Housing and the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors that we really wanted to. The CIH was under quite severe financial pressure, and I think probably their focus was more about, and Grania, who was then the chief exec, more about balancing books and influencing the government on housing policy at the time, which didn't exactly coincide with RICS ambitions. RICS is primarily a regulator and a professional body about ensuring the competency of its members, and public policy influence is, because of that, not a prime activity, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes plenty of sense. But see, what a worthy effort, though. You know, and it sounds like damning with faint praise when you say that, but actually you don't get much produce out of the tree unless you shake it occasionally, and that was a great effort to try and shake that tree, I think. Michael, you're a property professional, and so many of the housing association people around the UK are chartered surveyors, or if not members of RICS, certainly started that way. It's very much a core function of all of the professional housing courses, as I understand it. What's your sense of, as Britain slides into, at best, a U-shaped recession, quite possibly an L-shaped recession, the impact and the nexus between property, lending, debt markets in particular, where you guys sit in that?
I think that question is a really good question, and doubtless we could have a one-day conference or a whole week seminar just discussing it. I think the Bank of England came out yesterday and said they're envisaging a V-shaped recession. I don't know whether it's an L-shaped recession, V-shaped, W-shaped, or another shape of the alphabet. I think what we learned from the global financial crisis of 2008, 2009, wasn't just that we had a really long tail of austerity which impacted everybody's quality of life, but that we also learned that if you've got 3 economists in a room, they probably have 4 opinions between them, and certainly no agreement. Right now, we sort of had COVID and the lessons learned from COVID, or we're learning from COVID, at the same time as there actually was a rebalancing of the whole property market due to lifestyle change anyway. You know, the reality, a lot of people were shopping online. Oh my word. Now, under COVID, everyone's shopping online. If you can avoid going to the shops and get Amazon to deliver for you, that makes a huge difference. So what's the future of our high streets? What's the future of our market towns here in the UK? What's the future of retail? We've also learned, interestingly, that offices aren't actually essential for doing the job. What they are essential, I should mention, they are essential for socialization. Human beings are primarily social, and they need to be sociable with each other. And, you know, the last 100 days of working at home or whatever it is has been painful for many, not because they can't get on with their job because they've got a computer at home and they've got decent Wi-Fi. We've even got fiber in the middle of nowhere now. But they didn't have the opportunity to gossip about what was on TV last night or talk about whatever else they want to talk about. So there is a strong argument that from a property perspective right now, the 2 best sectors for investment are housing and distribution. And if you're looking more broadly as an investor, where is your safe havens? It will be housing and distribution, because they are the 2 that are most unlikely to be badly affected. That being said, you know, I remember being so jealous in 2008-9 when I was over with you about the size of Australian houses compared to UK housing. I think there's a real challenge as to whether since the 1970s, certainly since the 1980s, whether we've been building houses big enough for people actually to work from as well as to live from. So that's a bit of a challenge. But on the basis that people seem to be forecasting right now low inflation, and investors looking for a safe haven, actually investing in social housing through private placements, bond investment, whatever it might be, is actually probably quite a good prospect. We were just shortly before lockdown, we went into the market to raise another £20 million through a revolving credit facility. That's not been upset at all through the process. It's still going through. Slightly delayed purely because the bank we were working with, who won the tender, is also doing a lot of the business interruption loans that the government are doing, and therefore it's priority. And actually, we weren't running out of money, so it wasn't really a big issue. We're expecting to go back into the market properly in 2022 for another £50 million, probably through another private placement. Our funding advisors are pretty confident that we will still get that at incredibly low interest rates, and there will still be demand for us. So it's quite interesting that right now you can't say that there's an economic crisis that is going to derail housing associations. What could derail housing associations in taking advantage of that setup is actually political interference, if I'm honest. You know, back in July 2015, we suddenly had rent reductions announced by the Chancellor, completely unexpected. The previous October, he had announced our rents were going to go up by inflation plus 1%. And the following July, he said, no, that was nothing to do with me. That was some other geezer. But, you know, different government, different Chancellor, just happens to share my name. And your rent's now going to go down for 4 years by 1% a year, which, of course, actually hits your business plan for the whole 30 years because you're starting from a different base. So that's my concern. And yesterday's announcements from the government, which I still haven't caught up with completely, they said, rather than saying, you know, we recognise, you know, I think Boris Johnson, who, if there's anything he's really good at, it's coming up with slogans. And his new slogan is build, build, build. But he, in very small font, probably font size 1 underneath it, but not really social housing. So you've got a load of money, £12 billion, which was going to be spent over the next 5 years by by housing associations. Oh no, that's now over 8 years. Our funding deal for 8 years is now 12 billion. At a point when the IPPR reckon we need to spend 15 billion a year on social housing. So I can't say that I'm completely confident, but the reason I'm not confident right now is more to do with politicians than it is to do with the market.
And isn't that always the way? You know, we know our current minister and our current premier, I think, are friends of social housing. There's no doubt about that. You know, we are hopeful that either from a federal or state perspective that their attention will turn to the benefit of stimulating the residential construction industry and for social housing. There are so many economic reasons why that is such a sensible thing to do, but it really just does show you the extent to which we are buffeted by choices that politicians and governments make, or in most cases don't make. And so, you know, I'm reminded that, you know, for people in government, generally their choices are not between a good choice or a bad choice. Generally, their choices are between a bad choice and a worse choice. But there are no bad choices about social housing. So, you know, in terms of your bond raising and your debt raising, our national bond aggregator, which I think has come into being since last time you were out here, and I just want to give a nod to all of my power housing colleagues, because 16 years of lobbying eventually paid off. They've just done their third tranche into the market, and were, again, for the third time, oversubscribed, and for the first time, industry superannuation funds in Australia have contributed. Now, they contributed small amounts, but there are $7 trillion in industry superannuation funds and superannuation funds in Australia being invested all over the world, including in social housing in the UK and Ireland, but not in Australia previously. So this is a very positive move. Michael, time has got away from us, but in closing, and I don't want to close on necessarily a negative note, but you guys, you've not just got austerity from 2008 that you never really climbed out of, you've not just got COVID-19 rampaging its way through the community, but you've got Brexit as well. What do you make of all of this, Michael?
Well, my very short answer, and then I'll do the longer one. The short answer is it's a nightmare scenario. The slightly longer one would be massive concerns about the supply chain materials. We have a huge trading deficit with the EU on building materials, something like £46 billion a year. If you start putting in constraints, before you even get to tariffs, if you start putting in constraints on how things are going to get into the UK through our ports, etc., it's a massive problem. I'm really concerned about employment opportunities, the disinvestment that is inevitable. Why would you want to be in an offshore island to Europe if you're an international business, as opposed to being in a trading community of 27 countries? You know, I don't take this the wrong way. The government was celebrating earlier this week a possible £1 billion trade relationship with Australia. Whilst of course they've also at the same time turning down and dismissing a 290 billion trading relationship with the EU. I wonder whether we sometimes get the politicians we deserve, but not necessarily politicians who are capable or willing to help us through everything. I'm feeling this ideology seems to be the theme of the moment. And when you look at, funnily enough, at COVID, and you look at the three countries that have done COVID exceptionally badly, would be the United States, Brazil, and the UK. And the common ingredient of that is in their politicians and not having them up to the task. Any sensible businessman confronted with COVID would delay something like Brexit so that actually we can get over one before we had to face the other. Any sensible businessman would actually regard stropping around saying, oh, we're quite happy with no deal, as being a really bad negotiating tactic. You know, this has been a multitude of mistakes over the last 4 years, probably the last 6 years, which I'm afraid we will pay for generations. And, you know, if I'm honest, I'm really angry about it, particularly the removal of freedom of movement for my children and their age group. You know, we seem to be pulling up the drawbridge.
So I guess, you know, not wanting to be overly political, but these populist governments that destroy economies are generally voted out at the next election, assuming that there is in fact a next election. And so it does seem to take a while. But
you also have to bear in mind, Ken, different electoral systems.
Well,
you know, the reality is Trump lost the popular vote. The reality is the first past the post model we have in the UK, the Conservative vote actually only increased by 1% and they had a landslide, and they still had less than 50% of the popular vote. You know, so without a form of proportional representation and single transferable vote and things like that, you rarely get a government that actually has a mandate from a majority of the people.
Yes, indeed, that is very much the case. We here in Australia don't realise just how powerful mandatory voting is, I think. Yeah, right-wing populist governments, generally not the friends of social housing. Michael, I think that the question, of course, will be what do we think the transition will look like, and what our new normal might look like if we come out of COVID. And I say if because both you and I would understand how successful many vaccines have been produced for RNA coronaviruses to date in the world, which of course is zero. So I think, you know, this is our new normal for quite some time to come. But do you see any positives out of the environment that you're in at the moment?
Yeah, I think there's some learning for us. I think that the first learning, we talked about digital by default. I'm going to change that phrase. Digital first, analog second. So recognizing there's still instances, but actually there's an awful lot we can do digitally. I can't say that word very easily, but there's still the human touch, the human engagement, the human involvement is still got to be prioritized. The second one is actually, we've all got to really examine our successes and failures during lockdown and during the coronavirus pandemic, and actually not be tempted to revert to the old normal automatically. You know, there are going to be really good learning points. For us, for example, we're just about, today we're starting our catch up on routine repairs today. We consulted our tenants about how we were going to do that in May. We did not only a big survey where over 80% supported us on everything we suggested, but we did a big video conference with tenants on that. There's learning points there. Is what we're doing now going to be a temporary change, or actually, you know, right now our productivity, our repairs guys spend about 24–25% of their time just driving between jobs. Well, we're trying to eradicate this in the transition. So actually, if that works, is there something there for us to actually think about? And lastly, I think, you know, we have, while people are frustrated because we've been in lockdown and therefore they haven't been able to go to the pub, the restaurant, the cinema, the theatre, the beach, wherever, the reality is that work-life balance for many has improved. The amount of their free time they're able to spend with their family. So can we capture that and retain that so that it's there for the future? So the biggest risk for us all is we try to go back to how it was 4 months ago.
Indeed, and I share your optimism that what we've done in the last 14–15 weeks actually is beginning to create a new template. It is beginning to create a new way of thinking about how we communicate, how we deal with people, how we rack and stack and process issues. And so I think there's, you know, I actually have a lot of optimism about what we can do now. I mean, I think that will be a challenge, not just for executives and their boards, but also for government too, because government will now see that many of the, what I would suggest are moribund ways in which they have funded services in the past can now be done very differently. But it will require those services to be different, and not all services are geared to do that, I think. Michael, we've completely run out of time. We normally try and go for 45 minutes so we don't lose the audience. We've gone for an hour. I think that's testament to how much you can talk, Newey.
There's the pot calling the kettle black.
Indeed. Please pass on my and Sharon's regards to Catherine, to Tom, to Sarah, and to Andrew Savage and the remainder of your executive crew that I've met, and so many of your people. And thank you for sharing your time and being generous with your ideas and conversation, Michael, as always.
My pleasure, and everybody from your organisation and obviously yourself is very welcome over here anytime.
And I'm just, in a parting comment, I'm still wondering why you haven't funded Andrew Savage to come over and work with our development team, but you know, we'll get to that.
I'm sure we can come to a fee agreement, Ken.
Thank you, Michael.
You take care. Nice to see you.
Cheers.
Bye.